Our swing state is a huge player in the 2016 presidential race, and we're connecting Colorado to the candidates. On today's show, Republican Rand Paul. The junior senator from Kentucky is an outspoken critic of government surveillance and military intervention. His father, Ron Paul, ran for president last cycle, and like his father, Rand Paul is seen as representing a healthy chunk of libertarian-minded Republicans. He came into Colorado this past week hot on the heels of the Supreme Court ruling that legalized marriage for gay people, and Paul made headlines for holding a fundraiser here with the marijuana industry. Rand Paul, thank you so much for being on the show. We appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
So most people running for president figure they're going to come to Colorado and get a marijuana question. You're obviously making some headlines by being a little more friendly than the average GOP candidate. So talk to me a little bit about why we're hearing your name in connection to marijuana fundraisers.
Well, I'm a big believer in states' rights. I'm a big believer that when the majority in a state create laws, that the federal government ought to leave them alone, and really the federal government shouldn't interfere with states.
Yeah, our local audience here is pretty familiar with what it looks like to have retail marijuana in their neighborhood. Do you support legalization nationwide? Do you support allowing states to do what Colorado has done, or neither?
I've spent most of my time talking about decriminalization. That means taking the penalties to a more proportionate level. I think that putting someone in jail for 55 years for marijuana is ridiculous. Weldon Angelos is in jail for 55 years. There's a gentleman in Missouri in jail for life. There's a guy with 2 life sentences for LSD in Nevada. So it isn't about approval or disapproval of drugs. It's about whether or not it's a reasonable penalty to be putting people in jail for decades. I object to taking away the discretion of judges to try to find justice. A lot of kids make mistakes, and a lot of people in political office made mistakes when they were kids. Should we give people a second chance? I believe in second chances.
Well, do you support you said you're for states' rights. Do you support, if you were President Paul, do you support allowing Colorado to go forward with what it has, or would you use federal powers against the system that we have?
Yeah, I wouldn't interfere from the federal level.
All right, good enough. I read your op-ed on the Supreme Court's marriage ruling. I want to make sure I've got it right. You're unhappy with the ruling. You think marriage is between a man and a woman, but you argue the government shouldn't be involved in marriage anyway. Maybe now it's a good time to think about getting government out of it. Is that fair?
Seems pretty clear.
Okay. So do you think it's a bit insulting to gay people to say, now that the Supreme Court has handed you this right that everyone else has, all the straight people have, now we want you out of the club, now we want to shut the club down because you're in it?
No, it's always been my opinion, and I think we have to learn to live with each other. And what's difficult is that when we have a representative democracy, we have 81% of the people in Alabama believe in traditional marriage. And so are we going to say that they can't sort of have their own definition? One way to have your own definition is to privatize it, where each church has their own definition of marriage, and it is an insult to anybody. It just says, is this something that the federal government needs to be involved with? We never really ever had the federal government involved before. Our founding fathers didn't go to Washington to have approval or disapproval or defining moments or definition of marriage. It was always done locally, and I think it ought to be a local issue.
So Republican voters who are looking for someone to push back actively and get it back to traditional marriage, as they might call it, that's not really where you'd like to take things. You'd like to take it to more of a hands-off approach.
I think the best way for people to get along is to not force your opinion on another. And so what ends up happening is that people will agree to disagree on the issue.
All right. Bobby Jindal got some attention for floating the idea of getting rid of the Supreme Court. Mike Huckabee called for term limits for the justices on the Supreme Court. I know you just talked about term limits for Congress. How do you feel about the idea of term limits for the court, or some sort of voter referendum on them?
The proposals that I put forward have been term limits for Congress. I think it would be a good idea to term limit Congress. We re-elect like 96% of our incumbents, and I think it would be a good idea to have more turnover in office. I've met the men and women up there, and by no means is there a monopoly of knowledge in Washington. I think there are a lot of good people. I was never in politics before this. I'm a physician. I'm not a career politician. And people said, how can you run for your first office being the Senate? And I really think that brings some fresh blood to the Senate and also to Congress. So I think it would be a good idea to have term limits.
So that you're not interested in restructuring the U.S. Supreme Court?
I have not proposed that.
Okay. We'll talk a little bit about Cliven Bundy. While you were in Nevada, according to the AP, you spent about 45 minutes with rancher Cliven Bundy. Well, did you meet with him?
He came to one of our rallies.
Okay. And do you feel like he's going the right direction as far as federal land is concerned?
I don't know what direction he's going in. He was just somebody that showed up at one of our rallies. I think that he's actually expressed that he disagrees with me on land policy. I think that there should be legislation passed where federal management of the land goes back to the states. And my understanding is he disagrees with me on that. But yeah, he showed up at a rally.
Okay. No one-on-one meeting with him?
Yeah, we saw him one-on-one.
In a crowded room? You didn't go to a separate place?
We saw him and met with him, yeah.
Okay.
He came up, said hello, and we said hello, and we talked, and we chatted about land management for a while. But, my idea really is that federal control of the land has gone too far, and that the masters are too distant from us, and they don't understand sort of local concerns, because there always has to be sort of a balance between jobs and the environment, jobs and animals. I mean, there always has to be a little more common sense put into this, and I think we lose that when we let the control get too distant.
Well, my question was going to be, we're talking about a guy who is at the center of an armed standoff with federal agents, and whether you agree with the current policy on federal land. I mean, giving an audience to a person who did that as a presidential candidate.
I think you mischaracterize and mistake the situation.
Okay, fair enough. I'll move on. You get talked about as a figurehead of the libertarian wing of the Republican Party. I'm curious to know, what do you consider yourself first, libertarian or conservative?
I'd call myself a constitutional conservative.
And why?
Because I believe in the original interpretation of the Constitution.
Do you embrace the term libertarian at all, or do you think people misapply that?
Sometimes we say libertarian-ish. Sometimes we use the word liberty. There's a liberty movement. And I think more often within the Republican Party, people talk about there being a liberty wing or a liberty movement within the Republican Party.
All right, I'm going to make this my last question. Your father, Ron Paul, ran last election cycle. I can recall some pretty big, excited crowds for him as well. For the folks who got familiar with him, what's going to be the biggest difference between candidate Rand Paul and him?
I think people will get to know who I am. I've been in the Senate for 5 years, and I'm one who believes that we should only spend what comes in, that we should balance the budget. I'm somebody who believes in term limits. I'm somebody who believes that you shouldn't borrow money from China to send it to Pakistan, that we don't become stronger by borrowing money from China to send it elsewhere. And I'm someone who believes that taxes should be lower and the budget should be balanced.
Right. Senator Paul, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate it.
You.
Thanks for being on Balance.